All right, everyone, thanks so much for joining. We'll get started in a couple of minutes as folks continue to filter in. I see the numbers jumping, which is really great. I will start with an introduction. So happy Wednesday. Thank you for attending our webinar about defining your inclusive and really intentional people experience. What does that actually look like in practice? My name is Christina Giordano. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'm the Partnerships and Community Manager here at All Voices. For folks who aren't familiar with All Voices, we're an employee feedback management platform that really enables employees to anonymously and safely report things like harassment, bias, and culture issues directly to company leadership. And they're able to collect that anonymized data and share that with their leaders to ensure that these don't become systemic issues, and you're creating a psychologically safe place to work where everyone can do their best work as well. To set the stage for our conversation today, the workplace is constantly changing, and when you're remote first, a hybrid, or you're in the office as well, it's really important to build that culture of inclusion in an intentional way. 2/3 of candidates say that diversity, equity, and inclusion is an important factor in their decision-making process to accept a job offer, according to one Sapling study. And 83% of millennials found that they were more actively engaged in the work that they were doing, and inclusive companies are 120% more likely to hit their financial goals, according to a built-in report too. So it's not only a nice to have, but it's a need to have to retain talent and make sure that people feel empowered to do their work. So with that, I will pass it over to our panelists. Thank you so much for being here. If you can share a little bit about yourself, including your pronouns, role, and the work you do at your company, we'll dive into the conversation. If you can, remember this order. Brittany, you'll cap us off, and then Dawn, Renuka, Allison, and Tali. I'll pass it over to Brittany.
Thank you, Christina, for that introduction. Hello, everyone. My name is Brittany Rock. My pronouns are she, her. I am the Director of Talent and Diversity for Le Pain Quotidien and Little Beat Brands. My purpose is to build connections and community through accountability and understanding. And I do that more specifically by creating thoughtful and equitable and purposeful hiring practices and strategies for both restaurant brands at the support level and for our store locations.
And then Dawn, you're next.
Sorry, forgot the order that quick.
Hi. Oh, you're good.
Hi, Dawn Christian. I am the Executive Vice President and Head of Inclusion, Equity, and Diversity and Cultural Marketing for GCI Health, a PR and communications healthcare firm. And the way, what I'm accountable for and what I do in my day-to-day work, first and foremost, about me, I am unapologetically showing up as a belonging, inclusion, equity, diversity, access, and social justice leader. I do consider myself a tad bit of an activist as well. And that's me personally. What I do day to day at GCI Health is ensure that we are creating a space that is centered on inclusion, equity, and diversity as the standard, meaning that it's not only what we do internally, but that it permeates not only to what we do in terms of our client services, but also in our candidate experience, our employer experience, and is, a 360-degree commitment to inclusion, equity, and diversity. In terms of cultural marketing, we are a client services organization. And so for our clients, what this means is that we ensure that inclusion, equity, and diversity, and the lens on what it means to be culturally aware and culturally display cultural humility and cultural competence is at the core of our work. A lot of us, it's healthcare and it's communications. We are at the intersection of every conversation currently, in our current space. And so what we've done here is ensure that we've not only created a dedicated offering, but a skill set that supports our clients, that supports us as an organization, and then also ensures that our commitment is truly about and connecting and resonant of the communities that we serve together. Oh, my pronouns, she and her, sorry.
All good. Thank you for being here. Renuka, you're up next to WRI.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you for having me and having all of us panelists. And it's hard to go after dawn. So thank you, and thank you for bringing us together today. So my name, as you can see on the screen, is Renuka Iyer. My pronouns are also she, her, and hers. I work for WRI, World Resources Institute. We are a global think tank that specifically does work around climate change, food loss and waste. We do work around forest. So everything related to sustainability of the planet. We are getting into COP26 next week, actually, and you will hear everything about COP in the news. WRI does a lot of work. We do research and we bring our research findings to COP. The most important aspect for why I'm interested in the conversation today is that there is no justice possible if you don't think about climate justice, right? So thinking about these topics, they are so interconnected. To create a sustainable planet for us, we have to ensure that we put equity at the center of it all. So in my role at WRI, I'm the Chief Human Resources Officer, and DEI reports into HR. And what we're trying to do is make the DEI work more interconnected with HR work. So bringing or infusing the DEI lens into our policies, processes, and instructions for supervisors as we continue to find a way to create workplaces that are more inclusive, because they are not. And then personally, I stand for intentional leadership. So I'm gonna turn it over, I think, to Allison.
I think so. All right, well, hi everyone, I am Allison Sproul. I lead people and talent for ConnectRN, which is a health tech company that has an app allowing nurses and clinicians across the United States to pick up shifts at local healthcare facilities whenever and wherever they want. But more than that, ultimately, we're creating a psychologically safe community for clinicians to come in, share their wins, vent about, those difficult shifts, and really find that, workplace bestie that I think can be a little bit tougher in that healthcare setting. And I use she, her pronouns, by the way. And ultimately, I'm really excited about this discussion because somewhere between 70 to 80% of our clinical population identify as people of color. And it's incredibly top of mind and critical to us in our corporate team to try to mirror that as much as possible and to make sure that, from that corporate lens, we're creating opportunities for our clinicians to feel included, whether that be in that online community that I just mentioned, but also in the event that, they wanted to join the corporate team, but also too, how can we as a corporate team create those experiences for those clinicians without having that internal teaming match, So yeah, really grateful to be here.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tali. I use she, her pronouns, and I am currently the VP of People and HR at CoinDesk, which is a digital media company focused on cryptocurrency and blockchain news. So very fun, exciting, evolving industry to be in at the moment. I'm really excited about this conversation as I have an ethos of creating an environment where we level the playing field for all staff to succeed. And I think in order to do that, you have to be intentional in your practice, and you have to get, everyone on board with what that means in practice. And so I think that in order to level the playing field, you need to really, really be inclusive in everything that you do, inclusive in the programs that you set out that impact the very people that are involved in that program. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing from the rest of the panelists and talking about this topic today.
Awesome. Thanks for doing some introductions. And that's a good segue into the first question. We're going to talk about, the folks on this panel, as you've heard, are in people, diversity, equity, and inclusion teams, but it's not only these teams and, folks' responsibility to create an equitable workplace environment. It's everyone's responsibility at the company. And we're going to talk about tangible ways to do that. On our pre-call, we talked about for scaling and growing companies, it is never too early to start thinking about how you can be more inclusive and really think about that holistic strategy. Even if you have lean resources, you need to think about it. Tali and Allison, your companies are both experiencing some growth at this period. Would love to ask you how you're thinking about, starting this planning and what you are prioritizing. Tali, I'll pass to you first.
Sure. Thank you. So I think a lot of times companies and individuals at companies leading these efforts, unless you have like a real DEI expert, which I'm not, I don't claim to be, I think we need to start with an assessment of where we need to improve. Are our benefits equitable? Is there the same access to get promotion? Are there the same opportunities? Are managers having the same conversations with all of their direct reports and meeting them where they are? So often we really we are not aware of the things that we need to improve upon. So going with a consultant who's truly an expert in the DI space to look at all the programs, processes, systems that we use internally is going to be a great first step in understanding, okay, what do we do well? What do we need to improve? And how can we get there? And I think in tandem to that, asking the people who work at the company, right? Because ultimately we're talking about including the people who are employed, right? So, and of course, candidates that come through the pipeline in recruitment, but getting a feel for how the organization views where the company stands in terms of like diversity, equity, and inclusion, and getting, that grassroots knowledge from them as to where, we should kick off our DI planning. So I would say those two facets are really important for a scaling company.
Yeah, I'm definitely aligned with Tali in that before you set out to do anything, and even if you do very little to no resources, whether that be financially in terms of your own people, teams, bandwidth, that level setting with a survey, whether you have a formal surveying tool like Culture Amp or otherwise, or a great feedback tool like All Voices, or even something as simple as a Google form, that's a great place to start to highlight, hearing from your employees, where are these inefficiencies for our team to address? Now, one thing that we did after the surveying, other than going out to an external consultant, as Tali also suggested, was to form an internal volunteer-driven DEI committee. And so these are folks who are coming from all departments at ConnectRN. We've got folks from our finance team. We've got, me from our people team. We've got folks in our customer support org, sales. And so really, when this group comes together, we're looking at three kind of cornerstones or pillars to ultimately create that inclusion. And so the first one is policy, to make sure that things are equitable, right? We noticed that this past year in an audit of our handbook that it mentioned nail length and how cleanly they needed to be, which perhaps in a clinical setting, would make more sense. But ultimately for our corporate team, most of us are working from home. So why do we have a dress code that says you can't wear shorts? Like, wear whatever the freak you want, as long as you're comfortable. So, policy was definitely the first thing. Second was education. We definitely needed to get some training on the books. And as much as I love the L&D side of the business, I am definitely not a DEI facilitator. And so we reached out to Netta Jenkins, who is absolutely phenomenal, and have been working with her now on for a little over a year to provide a variety of trainings on a quarterly basis for us. Then that final pillar was celebrating multicultural events. And so we've been able to put on really phenomenal and educational experiences for all of our employees at ConnectRN to feel more included. So with Hispanic Heritage Month, we did a cooking night. During Black History Month, we did Hella Black Trivia that was through a company called Seshi, which is a startup that is Black co-founded. And so there have been a variety of events, both, more on like the fun and educational side that have helped us to create more of that sense of inclusion without having thousands and thousands of dollars or a dedicated DEI person to be able to do that.
Absolutely. So what I'm hearing is that you need to invest time to understand where you are foundationally and how your people are feeling in terms of priorities. Don't assume, and also invest in subject matter experts and resources that are already out there, not reinventing the wheel, and really relying on people whose body of work is around inclusion too. And this really permeates throughout when you're ready. When candidates are asking you, what are you doing about diversity, equity, and inclusion? You can share the intentional strategy behind there as well. Brittany, we were talking about also in the pre-call how, in the past or historically, that recruiting processes and just the candidate experience in general of how you source talent is, has a history of being discriminatory, and people are changing ways to do that in terms of building pipeline as well. But I want to ask in terms of recently, how have you kind of adapted the candidate experience to be more inclusive, and if you have any recommendations on there as well?
Sure. Thank you, Christina. So we are in a space of really like reimagining and reinventing traditional hiring practices, which have, historically been discriminatory and has excluded marginalized communities and identity groups, especially Black and Brown people. And so as we are scaling what our commitment to equity, inclusion, and diversity and justice, which is in itself so tiered, from a talent perspective, we have acknowledged and are addressing the systemic and the process inequities that are consistently keeping people from opportunities. And so as I look to, create more equitable opportunities for specifically people who are interested in the corporate or support level positions, it's really where we have started is with the hiring manager conversations. And so how we have sort of revamped that is I lead with 3 questions for hiring managers to keep in mind throughout the recruitment and hiring process. The first is, whose experience is centered? And so the question is important to reiterate because it allows hiring managers who, in the case for me, mostly are someone who is identifying as being cis, white, and male, to constantly check themselves about how they're interacting and how they're showing up for candidates who do not look like them, right? And so how are you as a hiring manager creating a candidate experience that is centered on the individual you are speaking with? How are you creating questions, feedbacks, and comments that allow for the candidate to show up authentically and really provide an avenue for you to understand who they are in this experience and how it relates to the job? The second question is this action disrupting the status quo? And so when we think about, for example, qualifications for a role, right? Some people are saying, I need 12 to 30 years experience, and in knowing that marginalized communities have been excluded from certain roles or jobs, not because they're not qualified, but because of lack of opportunity, right? How can we talk differently about assessing qualifications and experience that don't just necessarily revolve around numbers, right? And so better yet, how are we as a company going to invest and spend company time and money to develop this person for any gaps that we may see from a skill standpoint? And so very often I hear people will say, well, I don't have the time to train someone, or I need this person to hit the ground running when we hire them. And my sort of question to combat that, is if as a company, if we're saying that we are really invested in creating equitable opportunities, I would really push the hiring manager in reiterating this question and saying, how are we beating the status quo? And the third question that I like to use with hiring managers is, are you open to feedback and how would you like that? And this is really crucial because sometimes as a recruitment leader, you may think, it's hard to hold people accountable, especially with certain positions and people that you're talking to. And it can be a little bit of intimidating and fear of giving them hard and valuable feedback on the recruitment process, especially as it pertains to equity, inclusion, and diversity. And so by having this question be a part of your initial sort of intake form, you're setting the standard and managing expectations that you will be giving them feedback around these areas in the process. Something else that we are definitely revamping our job descriptions. Employer branding and job descriptions are really sort of like the first entry point and introduction that people have to your company. And it's a place, where we have the opportunity to dispel myths and use this as a platform for people to really engage and see how your company is living out like your actual actions and values. And so I get questions from candidates all the time around, what is your company culture? How is your company supporting and advocating for marginalized groups in terms of growth and development? How is your company creating, safe spaces for employees? And I think every organization should be prepared to answer these kinds of questions. And you can do that honestly and in some points and pieces of employer branding and in job description. So there is so much performative inclusion in work being presented to people. And so employees and candidates are, it's really hard for them to really say, who's really real? Who's real and about this kind of work in a real kind of way? And so some of the things that I think are important to list right now, aside from the traditional roles and responsibilities in a job description are, actually stating how are you supporting marginalized groups? And this question is real and one that people are very concerned about. And not only listing how you're doing that through, i.e. employee resource groups or EID committees, but also listing their goals and how those groups are supported really critically, right? Like how is the company supporting these groups for success in order for change to happen? That's one. Two, I think it's really important to be transparent about where your company is at. Very sort of piggybacking off of Allison's point, really state where your company is at from an inclusive standpoint. I think creating falsehoods and unmet promises is something that marginalized groups have experienced for far too many times. So being very clear about where your company is at and where you want to be is definitely a great point to list in a job description. Other things is throughout the interview process, being able to give candidates actual feedback forms. So every step of the process, I want to be able to hear feedback about what part of this process did you love? And then what part of the process could we have done better? And very early on from the entry point of a candidate's experience, they're now sort of getting a sense of, oh, this is a community of feedback. They want it very early on, not only when I'm actually in the organization, but even as a candidate, they want to know what my experience is like. So those would sort of be like the two things that I would say that we have definitely pushed in the last year in terms of revamping what the candidate experience is like.
I love that. I think those three questions to ask and just your focus areas are really important too. And building that culture of feedback from the beginning before someone is at the organization is also important to highlight as well. Dawn, I know we were also discussing this too, and something that you're currently working on at GCI and something that you're also passionate about too. So I want to make sure that we hear your perspective on just the candidate experience as well, an employer brand.
No, thank you very much, Brittany. I mean, there were a lot of points that I would just plus one, so I'll just say that. But the other piece I think is that your candidate experience is your employer experience. They are not detached from one another. So, and what I mean by that is that if you have current employees that are having an experience, and you are actively recruiting and expecting people to want to land at your organization, you need to understand the connectedness between those two bodies, right? Most people today, especially with platforms like LinkedIn and others, are going to go and reach out within their communities and ask questions about your lived experience at your organization. And so we need to make sure that when we're thinking about the corporate branding, the employer branding, that the experience that existing employees are having and the experience that you would like to present to candidates as a possibility for them to have some synergies. And so when you're pulling that lever around, are we asking the questions? Are we being inclusive in the nature of our questions, using things like behavioral interviews? Brittany, she spoke a little bit about understanding what it takes to be successful in a role. So do you understand the capabilities, and are you able to articulate what those capabilities are that allow for someone to walk in and see themselves, envision themselves being successful in the role? And the hiring manager, she spoke about having this needs assessment, pulling the hiring manager further up the funnel and giving them a sense of accountability as to what would make a candidate successful from the start of a conversation, so that that is streamlined as they come in, that expectation is set. So understanding what those capabilities are and being very intentional. We're hearing intentional a lot, but intention means specificity. So have you drilled down for that function, for that manager, for that role, exactly what those things are? And then here's the other piece that I also will pull a thread from what Brittany said, which is the experience or time of experience that some populations have had. And I'll use the term rising populations versus marginalized populations. But that rising populations have had may have been truncated for various amounts of reasons, right? They haven't been able to get 10 years of experience in a certain form. Are you educating around culture at? Are you educating around, what it means to identify a transferable skill set and see that actively applied in your workspace? And can you articulate that and suss that out in the interview process in a way that a person can come in and say, well, maybe I haven't been in this industry, but I've executed these things in a real tangible way and can see how this can apply to this job and in this role and working specifically with you. So the two things that I'm really pulling out here is know what you mean when you have a job description, know what the succession of that job really looks like, and be able to speak about that pathway for that person that maybe doesn't have all of the traditional experience, but you can acknowledge that there's something that they can bring to the table that may not look like everyone that came before them, or at least the majority of the folks that came before them. When the question comes up around representation, understand the question and be willing to ask questions that allow for clarity. When they say representation, not everything is race and ethnicity. Some things are neurodiversity. Some things are disability differing abilities. Do we know how to speak about those things? And do we have the cultural competence, the lexicon, and the acknowledgement of where we are? I've heard assessment. So do you know where your organization is on all of these things to be able to truly speak to, this is what our environment looks like today. But yes, this is where we're headed, and this is how we're intentionally driving towards those things. And then be able to speak to the activations, speak to the KPIs or the key performance indicators, and speak to the timelines that have been put in place, the process and the organizational structures that have been put into place to make those things a reality. But please, please, please understand that when you're investing in trying to get talent to come in, you also need to have a parallel investment in the experience of your current employees. So think about employee resource groups, think about leadership and mentorship, and sponsorship is different than mentorship on ways of making sure that the current employees are having an experience where they can see a succession and help to represent the full-bodied experience of what it would be like to work within your organization. And so that's my approach, at GCI Health. And so, we are on a new evolution, and you're hearing evolution a lot with IED, and that's fair, but know what that evolution is and know exactly where you are and with specificity where you're going for the full-bodied experience for both experience, new talent, and existing talent so that folks can really get a handle on what it means and how it's being actioned upon within your organization.
Yeah, I would love to continue kind of the theme around getting specific, and everybody's at a different point in their inclusion, diversity, equity journey as well. And a lot of folks are raising their hand to be employee resource group leaders to maybe transition onto the people or diversity, equity, and inclusion team directly. But we kind of talked about this at the beginning as well, in terms of how everyone at an organization can have that equity mindset, how you empower folks. Renuka, I would love to know your opinion in this realm in terms of empowering folks across the organization, no matter if you are a hiring manager, a new employee, junior, senior level person, and also with, again, the historical context that you shared as well, in terms of organizations historically being a place of command to control, some questionable practices. How do you create that inclusive environment for folks in this workplace setting?
Thanks, Christina. And, I'm going to pick up where Brittany left off, because I think she had a powerful business case. And I'm going to come back and talk about business case. We covered what can we do when we're dealing with candidates. But given the great resignation that's going around the world right now, and specifically here in the US, your candidates, when converted, are no longer just employees. They continue to remain candidates, continue to remain people that you need to invest in, right? So the market has shifted. And I think just being aware of that and being able to articulately talk about that within the organization is important. But as we think about long-term, how do we kind of make sure that this sticks? Whatever we've started sticks, because we didn't get here by chance. This was intentional. This discrimination that we're seeing in the world, not just in our own workplaces, but in the world today, was intentional. So we have to intentionally, correct it. Then I think we need to start with the mindset. And we've all heard about organizations talking about culture fits. And I think the question that Brittany asked is, whose experience is centered and what can that person bring that we don't have, right? What is the gap that we're inviting these people to? So shifting the mindset of the organization from a culture fit type mindset to a culture contributor type mindset. And then why would organizations do that? Unless organizations have a strong business case, organizations will not do that. And so my business case that I think we're, of course, in WRI, we're kind of anchoring this, but also in other places, it's about expanding the circle of influence, right? Organizations, whether they are for-profit, non-profit, we're all trying to expand our circle of influence and create the impact in the world, whether we are selling a product, selling a service, or whether we are, writing research, as in the case of WRI. So, thinking about the mindset and then focusing on what is the business case. Why does this organization need to invest the resources? And I'm sure we're going to talk about resources at some stage in this, but we need to invest resources to institutionalize some of the practices that we've begun. If not, we would find a point in time in our lives where, for the next 2 or 3 years, we'll be talking about this, and then we'll forget about it. That's not what will get us the kind of change or the transformative change that we're looking for. So some of the things that we've been doing at WRI, we've begun tracking, right? So we've gone big on dashboard, so a lot of tracking and publishing the results of what we are finding year over year. So that's one thing. We've started training, and the piece that I think really caught our attention is training on implicit bias, right? Because as human beings, you can't really not say that we shouldn't have implicit bias. Guess what? That's a myth, right? We all, as human beings, we have implicit bias. So being aware of what implicit biases I have, and then working around them to make sure that we put in place an objective process to give opportunity for all to be part of the organization is something we can do intentionally. So I think that's where my stand for intentional leadership comes into play. And being aware of our own biases, I think, is a good step that I think all organizations should take. And there's so much research around implicit bias, so it would be a shame that we didn't use that. And then we also talked about safe spaces, and that is certainly something we should do. But I think that's not good enough if we have to move the agenda forward. We need brave spaces. We need our We need every employee to tell us what their lived experience is and what's not working for them. And I think, Brittany, you started off talking about the feedback culture, the community of feedback. We need to continue that community of feedback even internally when our staff join us. And then, as Don has mentioned, people, our candidates are reaching out to others within the organization to find out if this is truly, in fact, a place that the organizations talk about. So, making sure that that we bake in those things. We bake in tracking, training, and creating brave spaces in which people can really tell us how they feel and what we can do together to create an environment and create a workplace that can be more inclusive than it is today.
Absolutely. It needs to be really intentional. Go ahead, Brittany.
Oh, I just wanted to just hop on what you were saying really quickly about brave spaces. I love that terminology, one. And one of the conversations that we had to have early on with our senior team in regards to sort of creating these brave spaces is that a lot of times, though, this phrase will get thrown around, oh, I have an open door policy, come in whenever. And I get that, but I also want to acknowledge and say that just because our leaders say so doesn't mean that it is so. And so I think that's a huge point to identify, is saying, how can we create these brave spaces, but then also knowing that there's still some fear and intimidation there. And although we are saying this is a safe space, knowing that actually creating that safe space takes time to build, one, and two, it's very action orientated, right? Like, people are looking at how you respond to things, how you comment on things, right? And if you are continuously commenting or responding in a way that isn't conducive to safe spaces, I'm not going to show up. And so really identifying what does a brave space mean, and what does it take from everybody to actually get there so we can have that authentic and inclusive input.
I think that speaks to really getting specific, not only about what you're saying, but what you're doing as well, because people can definitely tell when you're being authentic or you're just providing lip service to something as well. Tali, I wanted to ask what you are seeing in terms of intentional leadership and really encouraging an equity-driven mindset in terms of systems, processes, and the culture at CoinDesk.
Sure. I'm just going off of Brittany's point. I think, yeah, like when leaders say we have an open door policy and then they suddenly become defensive to feedback, or they dismiss whatever a staff member has brought to their attention, that can be really harmful to the individuals trying to approach them. So I think it's really important for leaders to just sometimes not necessarily not react, but like just listen generously to the concerns that employees have, and to really listen, to digest, and then reflect on it, and then close that feedback loop eventually. Because so often people give feedback and then it goes into, I don't know, the metaverse or something, and people don't hear back from their leadership team or their managers. And I think closing that feedback loop is really critical to creating an inclusive environment where people feel comfortable raising their ideas, raising their concerns, and knowing that their leaders are going to not only listen, but get back to them on where they stand with whatever it is that the employee had brought up. I think that benchmarks and KPIs are really important, because how do you know you're doing well in terms of IED, or in terms of having an inclusive workplace? Well, you need to have the numbers in some ways, whether that's an employee pulse survey that's run every couple of weeks, or whether that's a workforce diversity report that you're looking at year on year. I think it's really important to have things to compare, your current state to your past state, to see, have the initiatives I've taken on really move the needle with the benchmarks that we set to be, important indicators of how we're doing as an inclusive company. So I think beyond that, I think education is huge, right? like so many, I didn't invent this obviously, but DEI should be part of an organization's DNA, and that means that it doesn't start or stop with a DI function or an HR function. It really has to permeate throughout an organization. So when I think about CoinDesk, we are a news publication, and so we publish a lot of information based on source intelligence. And so if we don't have diverse sources, we're likely going to tell more stories skewed to what the sources have given us information about. And if we have a variety of sources from many different identities, we're able to actually provide a more holistic narrative on what's going on when we're publishing news. And so that's just one example of like how this mindset of equity and inclusion really has to permeate throughout the organization. And when you're thinking about marketing and stuff, if you're not communicating to your target audience, like you want to get as large of a target audience as possible, but if you're not showcasing whatever work you're doing in marketing to a large target audience that includes people of all identities and backgrounds, then you're only really being myopic in your approach and how you get things done, because you will just focus on one group, and that really actually hurts the business at the end of the day. So I think it's a DEI mindset that really needs to be ingrained in the organization and integrated throughout. And I think you need ongoing education. I think you need people to get to the same baseline, like what does DEI mean for the company? And then how do we all aspire to integrate that into what we do every day? And insofar as to say performance management should have an equity, inclusion, diversity component to it, such that we are held accountable to the DEI commitments that we've made, and we're holding the entire organization accountable for their actions within it. So I think that's really important. And last, I think the tools that we offer personnel to give feedback and to provide their insights are really important. Some people won't feel comfortable raising their hand and saying something out loud and attributing their name to it. But if you have an anonymous way of providing feedback, that can be really helpful for the employee to feel like they can express themselves and be heard.
Absolutely. And I do want to touch on accountability, because we have been talking about strategy and creating those brave spaces, but in terms of individually holding yourself accountable, holding leaders like people managers and hiring managers and executives accountable as well in the organization. Allison, we'll start with you, but anyone can answer this question. How do you think about accountability? What does that really look like in practice?
Sure. I mean, I think in large part, this goes in part back to what Tally was just saying, where you've got to have some kind of data to back things up. You can't manage what you don't measure. And it's very difficult to create equity within an organization if you're holding people to a different standard. So something as simple as writing down your goals and sharing them out and being transparent about them. And also, not being afraid to admit when maybe you haven't hit them. So, at Connect RN, we've been very intentional. And as a part of our DEI committee's commitment, we said that we were going to share out our data on a quarterly basis surrounding the numbers of underrepresented groups historically within our organization for our corporate employee headcount. And, after having this DEI committee for just around a year, we hadn't seen nearly as much of an impact on the numbers as we'd hoped. And so it helped us to really sit down and take a good hard internal look at, okay, well, here is the data. We've done a lot of stuff. And I will say, as a part of our inclusion survey, we did see an uptick in belonging, but we still haven't necessarily, seen too much of a change on the recruitment side of the house. So what are the levers that we need to adjust to, make that happen?
jump in as well. I think the approach that we've taken at WRI is really pay attention to that. What is the meaning of the word accountability, and what do we mean when we say responsibility, right? So those two words. And really, I think education around those words, because responsibility is simply the ability to respond to something. So when you see something, say something. And Christina, I talked to you about the workplace color spectrum that we are implementing at my organization, helping people speak about their experiences in the here and now, right? And encouraging them to do so. So that is the ability to respond. And then accountability, really getting very clear that there are consequences for actions, right? So getting clear about what consequences are available, or what consequences are there for what actions, and getting very clear about that, and being transparent about it. I think, under HR, we've gone back and we've been looking at, what instructions do we give our managers? So we have policies, we have processes, and that's where we stop, right? But what we are doing now is looking to see policy, process, manager behavior. So we are defining manager behavior for every aspect of how the policy gets implemented, right? So here's the policy, here's the process, here's what managers are expected to do, here's what employees can expect from their managers, and getting very clear of it, because really the human resources team or any other team, DEI, we are not in the weeds on things, right? The people come to us after the fact, after something has happened. So getting very clear about what these pieces mean in an organization, what is acceptable and what is not acceptable in the workplace environment is something that we're getting very clear about.
I think that's definitely kind of helpful to understand as well. And along those same lines of getting specific and providing examples throughout this conversation, we do have an audience question that I'm going to read out. So it was sent to us. So I have an African-American male executive who is feeling simultaneously bullied by a white female executive who believes herself to be inclusive and is silenced by his own fears of being perceived as the quote unquote angry Black man. Working with him or her on how to communicate and share feedback has unearthed more issues, and it's completely counter to our culture. Would love some thoughts for the group. Dawn, I believe you have some advice for the person who asked this question.
Yeah, first I want to acknowledge and also just really honor the fact that this is a lived experience, right? Oftentimes we see that these incidences and these moments happen, but we don't acknowledge that they're real and have an impact. So I want to acknowledge that person, and I can't really apologize for it because it wasn't me, but I want to acknowledge that it exists. And so I really, what's happening here is that there are multiple levels of dimensions of diversity, and one of them is power structure, right? And so if this person is experiencing this and this by this white or Caucasian manager and is an African-American or BIPOC employee, that already, regardless of their ethnic identity, is going to create a dimension of diversity, which is power, right? And then if a person is expressing that they are inclusive but not demonstrating it, it makes it difficult to pinpoint or to call a person out and be specific around, well, this doesn't feel this way. When you do this, it doesn't feel this way. So what we need to make sure that we do in this position, and then we also know that there are societal kind of conditioning that if, and I'm a BIPOC woman, I know in my history, I have been coined the angry Black woman. And here's my response to that. Maybe what the experience is enough to have caused me to be damaged enough, traumatized enough, affected enough that what you're seeing is anger and what I'm experiencing is trauma. And so that person who's experiencing that trauma, I want to encourage you that you have every right to coin it and accept that that is in fact what it is. If you cannot go directly to the person and speak to them and say, when you do this with real specificity, this is how it makes me feel. Can you talk to me about that? Now the onus is off of you, and the accountability is for that person to exchange a conversation. If you don't have the comfortability to be able to do that, then if you can, bring that to someone else within the organization that maybe you have that psychological safety and that trust with, about that dynamic, and see if there is a point where there's a point of sponsorship where that person can step in and have a dialogue, maybe with the three of you, or maybe just one-on-one with that person. At GCI Health, we've gone through a couple of iterations of inclusion, equity, and diversity learning. We don't call it training because we're behavioral, so we're trying to impact behaviors, that we've been able to establish ambassadors. And these ambassadors are extensions of myself, right? They are places where folks can go and have these conversations. It does not need to come to me. It does not need to come to another person, but it's a person that you know is aware of how to have these conversations and has stated and demonstrated the advocacy and the sponsorship abilities to be able to speak, to advocate, and to engage. Not every organization has that, but if there's someone that you can identify that is something like that, then I implore you to include that person. But first, validate that your feelings are, I don't need to validate them. Validate them for yourself, that they are real, that happened or is happening, and that you are well within your right, if you will, to be able to articulate that this is no longer a safe space for you. I am very committed to not declaring safe spaces, but ensuring that we are building and creating them. Just because you say it's a safe space does not mean that it's safe for the person that you're saying it to. So we need to demonstrate that there are multiple ways to find that psychological safety. And then for that, the person that's actually having these interactions and causing the effect, once that is realized, let's figure out, we have to be equitable about the fact, we talk about equity, but we have to be equitable about the fact that culture has not always presented itself where we can talk about what's right and what's offensive in the workplace, right? We have not always been in this space. 2020 was pretty much a reckoning. And from there on, we've now been able to have these conversations that we really haven't had before. So once that person has been identified, the action has been identified, supply the coaching and the development and the pathway for that person to improve their behavior, and hold them accountable with some very specific dates, certain actions, and other things to ensure that not only are they aware, but they are provided the skills, support, and the pathway to improve that behavior. And then, on the flip side, make sure that this person who has experienced this, go back to them after this has been raised and check in with them periodically and see if the climate has shifted for them. Do they now feel more safe? Are they having better conversations? Are they feeling more of a sense of belonging? It is not an incident when these things present themselves. There has been a conditioning. There has been something in the culture that has told folks that this was okay to even start to do. And I'm not, and so we need to make sure that along the way, we're conditioning ourselves for the trajectory of change, which is not instantaneous. And the support needs to be had on both sides.
Dawn, thank you so much for providing kind of your insights on this and kind of your lived experience, and also tangible ways that this person can address the situation. Renuka, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly add, I think Dawn has some great suggestions. I'll quickly add that, this oftentimes I found that managers get caught into what is right and what is wrong, right? That's the conversation. It's the right and wrong conversation. And I found it helpful to move that conversation from right and wrong to intent versus impact, right? Because oftentimes managers don't intend to have that desired, it's not their desired impact, right? That's not the impact they hope for. And so when you're speaking to this supervisor, moving the conversation from it's right or wrong, or we are going to correct you for this, moving that from, hey, what is your intention and what is your impact? And really, your behavior doesn't match the impact you desire. So, so the behavior is not matching the impact. nor is it matching the intention. So something needs to change, and what needs to change is the behavior. So I found that moving that conversation along that spectrum is helpful.
And if I could just follow up on that impact comment, because I think that's so powerful, and I'm so glad that you brought that out, is to ensure that if you are in the position of receiving that an incident or something that's happened, and it's very natural and very human to say, I don't think that's what that person meant, that is not yours to own or to speak on. And one of those responses and ways to acknowledge the lived experience and the impact that has been made is to say, thank you for bringing this to me. And I appreciate the courage or how you've shown up, but let me have this conversation and come back to you and then have that conversation around impact. I think it's really important not to declare that that impact wasn't intended because you haven't had that conversation yet. So let's make sure that we're also acknowledging that. So I really appreciate that.
I can't believe we only have a couple minutes left. We could talk for a long time about this and give specific examples. And I really appreciate everybody's vulnerability and also just being on this panel here this afternoon. If we could, in our last couple of minutes, if you could share like a one-line call to action that you hope folks on this call will take with them, no matter where they sit in the organization. I know we didn't get to everybody's audience questions, but you can send them to us afterwards and we'll do our best to answer them as well. So would love to start with Dawn for your call to action.
My call to action would be, yes, intentional, but be specific. Make sure that there is an air of specificity when you are speaking to an action, an activation, a goal. Make sure we know who we're talking about, when we're talking about it showing up, and what the desired outcome or change or effect may be. Specificity.
And then Brittany.
That was mine, Dawn, but I'll add to that. In addition to the specificity, I know that this work can be so extremely overwhelming. It can be scary. But I really would encourage people to show up and be as loud or as gentle as you choose to be, honestly, and don't be afraid to push people out of their comfort zone, because it's in that discomfort that the real change actually happens. So if you're not feeling uncomfortable in these conversations, chances are you're not pushing yourself to think that far. So if you are feeling discomfort, that's where you should be, because that's when you start to think, oh, this doesn't feel good. How can I change this?
Allison, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, my call to action would be to always be thinking about ways you can increase access to opportunities, either for folks already within your organization or candidates. I mean, there are just so many outdated the ways of thinking, whether it be requiring an arbitrary degree or exclusively recruiting from Ivy League schools to not being open to candidates who could identify as neurodiverse. I think that there's a lot of room for opportunity for us to push back on hiring managers and similar to what Brittany was saying, challenge that status quo of who they thought the quote unquote perfect candidate was.
Tali.
I guess I have two calls to action. I think the first is, one, as an individual, like always challenge yourself to learn more and be curious and understand. I personally have taken a dismantling whiteness class this past year, and it was like life-changing because I could, find, for once, see outside of myself and learn so much about, the things I don't know too. So definitely continue learning. And two, for HR practitioners or for any managers within an organization, just like listen to your people and ask for feedback.
I love it. And Renuka.
Yeah, I think, I did something like that as well. As Tally said, I took a class on race for representation. The reason I say that is Toni Morrison is very powerful. I'd encourage each of us to learn about it. We don't know why we are experiencing what we are experiencing. So please, I think that's the first step. But the call to action that I would like to recommend is your workplace is yours as much as it is your CEO's. Right? So please take ownership. If something is not right in your home, you will talk about it and you will fix it, right? So instead of leaving this home and going to another, fix this home. That's what we need. And I believe that leaders come in all seats. So please pay attention to what your CEO is saying. And, if there's something that you want to give them feedback on, send them an email. They're just an email away. Send them an email. Talk to others around you about what you're hearing and step in. Because the moment is now. There is so much social revolution going on around us that it's very easy for HR to situate some of the policies, processes, and create institutional change if there is a demand for it. So please help HR really make this transformative change stick.
Brittany.
Thank you.
Oh, really quickly, I just wanted to say this is really on my heart. Everyone has a role in activism, and be authentic to who you are in that. So not everyone has to be on the front line, right? If you are a creator, if you are a healer, if you are a talker, figure out what your lane is and do the activism and justice work in that lane. Remain authentic to who you are, because that's where you're going to have the most work done, and that's where you're going to be the most that's how you're going to make the most impact. So really remain authentic who you are in your activism.
That's an excellent point to end on. Thank you so much, everyone on the panel, for taking the time to share your experience with us and advice, and have a great rest of your afternoon. If you have questions around All Voices, feel free to reach out to me. If not, continue doing great work. We'll see you guys soon.
Thanks, Christina.
Thank you.